Good morning, students! I'm Professor Crimsy, and today I'm coming back from the grave to give you yet another Clip Studio Paint tutorial. So welcome back, people, and take a seat because we'll be here for a while today. I have a lot of things to cover in this video, and I really don't think you'll want to miss out on today's topic. First, I'll introduce you to custom brushes and their most important settings, but more specifically, I'll show you two techniques I use to create 6 custom textured brushes, which emulate traditional mediums like paints, watercolors, and pencil, among other things. These 6 custom textured brushes were made to fit the needs of my current projects, and they feature my Messy Ink Pen, Cursed Ink Pen, Dark Void Brush, Evil Thorns Brush, Fleeting Arts Brush, Watery Arts Decoration Brush, and finally my Haunted Watercolor Brush. So let's just begin right away by learning how to create a custom brush. By default, Clip Studio Paint already has a wide variety of brushes available in their libraries, such as pen, pencil, brush, airbrush, decoration brushes, and all of these main categories also have their own subtool categories. All these brushes can already do wonders for your art, but let's say today we want something custom made. The first thing you need to do is create a new square canvas. I decided to go with a 4000 pixel square canvas, and I always keep my resolution at 300 when I work. It's a good habit to keep in general when you work with digital art, so let's click OK, and here we'll have our new canvas. The next step is optional, but it's a personal suggestion of mine. What you can do is go click on these 3 little lines right up here. This will open a drop-down menu with the option Add from Default. When you click on this, a new window will pop up, and then you can select which tool menu you want to duplicate in your tools menu. Just go on the brush option, highlight it, and click OK. As you can see, we now have the same menu here twice, but this one I will right-click on, go to Brush Settings, and rename Crimsy's Homemade Brushes. Now, the reason why I do this is because I would rather make my own little library of custom brushes and not mess around with the default brushes by accident, especially since I already customized some of them to my taste, and I don't want to lose these settings by mistake. There are 2 main types of brush tips you can design. One, you can hand draw any type of shape in the center of the canvas as long as it touches none of the edges, which is ideal for brushes and color mixing. And 2, you can make a seamless brush that will form a perfect stroke, which is perfect for ink pen and repetitive patterns like chains, ropes, thorns, etc. To help you get a better grasp of all the settings, I created multiple brushes for each of those 2 categories, starting with the centered brushes method, featuring 5 different brushes: the Fleeting Hearts brush, the Dark Void brush, the Haunted Watercolor brush, the Sketchy Hearts Decoration brush, and finally the Cursed Pen. So first off, let's begin with an easy one to cover most of the basic settings. What we'll do is select a brush. Any type of brush will do, but keep in mind the result will be different depending on the brush you choose. And then we'll simply doodle the shape of the brush tip. Feel free to experiment with brush tips a lot. You can even include transparency if you want. The only important thing to remember is to always use pure black when designing a brush tip, because that's the default color every brush has to work with, just to work properly. It's as simple as that. Alright, so once you're happy with the shape of your brush, let's open the material window by clicking on the little arrow right here, then select All Materials, Image Material, and now right-click on Image Material and select New Folder, which I will name once again Crimsy's Brushes. Once this is done, we can close the Materials panel and create our brush. So first, let's hide the white background because we don't want that included in the brush, and then we can go to Edit, Register Material, Image. Doing that will open a new window where you can name the brush tip, so let's name it Sketchy Arts, or anything else I actually used. And then, very important, make sure the Use Brush Tip Shape box is checked, because otherwise your brush will simply not be registered as a brush tip. And lastly, we will select the folder in which we want to save it, which would be the new folder we just created in the Materials panel. Now press OK and let's start playing with the settings of our brush. But in order to do that, we'll first need to create a basic subtool. To do this, we'll choose one of the top 4 categories of brushes in our newly created Crimsy's Homemade Brushes. I decided to go with the Thick Paint one, and we'll simply right-click on any of the brush, it doesn't matter which one, and choose the Create Custom Subtool option. As you can see, there are multiple options to choose from here, but for this brush I will keep the default options and only rename it Fleeting Hearts Brush and click OK. This will open a new window once again, and this is where things get very interesting and also very experimental. These are all the brush settings you can play with. So before I start explaining to you what all these settings can do, let's go get our newly made brush tip right here. You will see that by default the circle shape is highlighted and that the option to add a brush tip shape here is grayed out. So what we want here is to use a material, of course. By choosing this option, now you can add a brush tip shape, so let's just do that. And then type here fleeting, or the tag we gave to our brush. So our fleeting hearts design will pop right at the top. Highlight it and press OK. You might have noticed that the shape of the brush here at the top has changed as well. This is the brush tip preview that gives you a hint of what the brush stroke will technically look like on paper. And at this point, feel free to also test all the changes you make to your brush in your canvas, because all these changes will be applied in real time and can be experimented with as you go. So the first thing you need to know about the brush settings is that all these options here can be activated or deactivated upon clicking on this little high symbol right here. When you do activate one of these settings, it will also appear in the brush settings menu on your left. So you can freely play with them without having to come back to the settings menu every time. If you don't want your settings to be crowded with useless information, make sure to only keep the relevant settings activated and hide the rest. Also note that leaving this box unchecked does not deactivate the setting per se. It only affects its visibility in the tool properties. So let's start from the top. And little note here, I will only go over the important settings pertinent to each of the brushes I made, so don't fret too much if I don't explain everything from the get-go. Chances are they will get explained later on, so let's begin. The brush size affects the scaling of your brush, so I'd suggest you always keep this one visible. In the Ink tab, activate Color Mixing. Note that the color mixing option and the blending mode cannot coexist in the same universe, so once you activate one, the other gets yeeted out of existence. So here's what the color mixing options do. The amount of paint dictates how dense each new layer of paint will be on top of the previous color underneath. So the higher you make this value, and the more the new color will override the old one. I put this one at 37 just to get decent enough blending. Then the density of paint directly affects the opacity value of your stroke as you apply it to another color. See it as another sort of opacity option like the first one, but unlike that one, this option actually blends the color together instead of just adding them on top of each other. I like to keep this one at 100 just to have the most vibrant color possible. The color stretch affects how much blending will happen between colors, so the higher you make the value here and the more colors will blend together. I usually keep it at default value. I don't really see the reason to change this one. Anti-aliasing I keep at the default value. Brush shape I never touch either, but this is where you could switch your basic brush shape if you chose the wrong preset to begin with, I guess. And that brings us back to the brush tip menu, where you can play with the hardness of your brush, as well as the thickness, which stretches the shape of your brush tip. But really, what interests me here is the angle option, because what this does is it rotates the angle of your brush. But you can also click on this little icon right here and choose the option Random. So for your whole stroke, the applied shape will come in a random angle, and this alone can give you some pretty interesting effects. Next, we have the spraying effect, which I will explain quickly because none of my brushes uses it. But basically, once activated, it creates multiple instances of your brush tip to make this sort of spraying pattern. And yeah, that's it. That's pretty self-explanatory, I guess. Just know it's there if you want to play around with it. The stroke tab also has some very interesting options to experiment with. The gap option dictates how dense your brush tip will be repeated in your strokes, including an option for a single dot, which props this little slider, so you can also define higher or lower custom values if you want to. I chose a value of 15 for this one, just to get a good middle ground. Please note that lowering this slider value below 15 has bigger chances of creating lag when drawing your stroke, and if you lower it down to the minimum value, there's a big chance of making your computer freeze from the huge amount of instances required to make the stroke, so you've been warned. Alright, so that's a pretty good starting brush. The shape looks nice, the colors blend well together. I think we can move on to our next brush, which also uses the same brush tip, by the way. I call that one the Sketchy Arts of Watercolors. This brush is a pattern brush mostly meant for decoration purposes, and in order to create this one, I went in brush tip, selected the Sketchy Arts brush, and this time I just left every setting on default. For the color mixing, I went with 30 amount of paint and 100 density of paint. Then in the stroke tab, instead of having gap activated, I clicked on ribbon instead. This option makes the pattern of your brush repeat individually along the stroke instead of overlapping the pattern on itself along the stroke, making it perfect for decoration brushes like this. Next, let's add a texture to our brush. The texture setting is the best for watercolors because it allows you to add texture to your stroke, which imitates the look of paint on paper really well. All you have to do is select which texture you want to apply to your brush, press OK, and all these options will also become available to play with, such as the density of the texture, the scale, the rotation angle, the blending mode. And finally, the watercolor edge is a setting made specially to create a better watercolor effect by adding a darker border to the edge of your stroke. You can also play with the opacity and the darkness of that edge for stronger results. I highly encourage you to check the little box named Process After Brush Stroke to reduce potential lagging as you create the stroke, and you will get the same results in the end. As you can see, this one was very simple to make, yet it looks very cute and captures the look of watercolors very well, I think. We will go over the next 3 brushes quickly because they're a mixed bag of the settings I already explained, but they're really fun brushes, so I really wanted to show you how I made them all very different, yet with all the same brush tip. I began by drawing little ghosts to represent the state of my current being, and then made them into a brush tip. In the brush tip tab, I selected the ghost for the material and then went on a crazy stretching spree by making the thickness value at 611. I made the stroke a ribbon and then activated the color mixing with the values 50 for amount of paint and 100 for density of paint. This makes the brush shape look a bit crazy in the canvas, but look at this fun stroke though, it's spooky, it's cool. It looks a lot like a pen, which is not usually made with a centered brush tip design, but the stretching is so intense that it works, so I wanted to share this weird technique with you in case you wanted to try it as well. The next brush I made using the exact same curse pen we just created. With it, I created this sort of spiraling shape and then turned it into a brush tip of its own, which I then called the Dark Void brush. Then I put the angle of the brush on random, the amount of paint at 25 and the density of paint at 100. And finally I played with the gap of the brush a bit to give it this very nice textured look. This brush is really good for blending and it also makes a pretty good textured pen if you make it small enough. And lastly, we have the Haunted watercolor brush. To create this one, I used the same brush tip as the 2 previous ones, but this time I wanted a good watercolor effect, so I put the angle of the brush on random and checked the Adjust Brush Density by Gap option box, which directly ties your gap value to the density of your brush, and I think it's a neat little setting to activate once in a while depending on the type of brush you want. I put the amount of paint at 34, the density of paint at 100 like always, but this time in the stroke tab, I put the brush on a continuous spraying, which generates multiple layers of the brush just by keeping it pressed down in your canvas. And I thought this option worked pretty well for this specific brush, but I don't think you might want to use it for every brush. It's really on a case-by-case scenario, really. I also played with the gap of the brush a little bit and left it at 7.4. Next, I added this paper texture to it with a density of 11 and a scale of 2. It's subtle, but that's what we want for this brush. And finally, I added some watercolor edge with a value of 4.1, level 2 opacity and level 1 darkness. And I checked the box Process After Brush Stroke, otherwise it would lag too much. As you can see, now when we mix the colors together and apply multiple strokes one over the other, there is this sort of watery effect appearing on the canvas that really feels like watercolor paint on paper. Again, it is subtle, but the texture it has looks pretty nice, I think. And that's it for the centered brushes technique. We got 5 very different brushes out of only 3 different brush tip designs, so that's pretty neat. But we still have 2 more brushes to make, and this time we will use the seamless brush tip technique. Our pen brush number 1 is named the Messy Ink Pen. Pens have the singular attribute of being generated as a continuous line, so you need the top of your canvas to fit with the bottom part seamlessly for this one to work. Otherwise, a seam will show in the stroke. For this brush, all I did was to create a black rectangle. Then you can draw your pattern into it. I chose to draw some ink blots. Make sure the pattern does not cross over the edges at the top and the bottom of the canvas. And once you're done, make a brush tip out of it. But this time, instead of going for a brush as our preset, we will choose the pen option and press OK. I then selected the brush tip we just made and left all the other settings here at the default value. After that, I went directly to the stroke tab and checked the ribbon option, which already gives you a pretty nice stroke. I also added some color mixing to the mix and put pretty much the same standard settings I used before, so 25 for amount of paint and 100 for density of paint. And then I added this paper texture to just get this more traditional look. I put the texture density at 100 and the scale at 72. Finally, I went to the correction tab, which we haven't really used yet, and I checked the eye icon for the stabilization feature. Stabilization is one of the best settings for pens and one to definitely look out for when creating line arts and just beautiful curves in general, as it slows down the process of generating the curve in order to smooth out your hand movement. And that's it. As you can see, this type of pen is really quick to make and it feels really good to use, honestly. And there are so many different patterns that you can play with, so go crazy with it. Now, I know we've been going on for a while, so let's conclude with our last pen brush design. For this one, you will also need to make a seamless design, but unlike the first one, we want a more complex shape to play with. So what I did is I drew some vines and added some thorns to them. If you guys have seen my first Clip Studio Paint tutorial video, which I will highly recommend you by the way, you will quickly understand where we are going with this. But basically, we are trying to make a seamless pattern. So we need the bottom part of the canvas to match with the top part. But clearly here it doesn't match at all. So what we'll do is go to View, click on Grid, and this will activate your grid. Then go back to View again, go to Grid Ruler Settings, put the gap at 1000 and the divisions to 1 and press OK. Finally, go back to View again and click on Snap to Grid. Now when you'll select your selection tool, it will snap to the lines of your canvas perfectly. So what you'll want to do is select the top half of your thorns, do a copy paste, so Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, and then take the top part of your thorns and bring them all the way down to the bottom of your canvas. And make sure there's no gap left between the design and the edge of the canvas. Do the same for the bottom part, but this time bring it all the way up. Deactivate your grid, and then all that's left to do is reconnect these two parts together in a logical way like this. When you're done drawing, redo the same process as we've done before, and voila! You now have a seamless brush tip. So for the last time, register it as a brush tip, create a new custom subtool with the pen preset, and press OK. There's not much to do here besides grabbing your brush tip, go to the stroke tab, check the ribbon box, and add some paper texture to it if you want to. I also activated the color mixing, but I left the amount of paint and density pretty high because it's not meant for color mixing. And that's it! We now got a pretty neat thorns brush. And using the same technique as I just showed you, you could also make ropes, chains, wires, vines, anything really along that theme, so just go crazy with it if you want to. Wow, that was a big video. I hope no one passed out from all that information I just shoved into your brain. I think that I covered everything I know about brushes and how to customize them, and I truly hope this video was helpful to you in any way. Please consider subscribing to my channel to help us out in return. And if you want more resources like this, because this is not going to be the only tutorials I make in the future, there are so many things to learn when it comes to Clip Studio Paint and digital art in general, and I'd be more than happy to bring you along the way as we explore all the nooks and crannies the software has to offer. But for now, that will be it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I am going back into my grave. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Au revoir.